The air in the penthouse was too clean, too sterile for the storm that was brewing inside its walls. Seraphina Vane, known simply as Sera to the handful of staff who serviced the obsidian tower, felt the chill of the marble floors even through the thick soles of her shoes. Her job was to make Caspian Thorne's world invisible, to ensure surfaces gleamed without ever seeing the reflection of the man who owned them. But tonight, she had seen too much. The scent of ozone from the high-altitude rain and the metallic tang of something akin to fear clung to the polished air. Sera was passing the door of the private study, a room usually sealed tighter than a vault, when she heard the low, intense tremor of voices. The door was ajar by a few inches, a momentary slip in the tower's fortress-like security. The accidental witness. The voices were sharp, laced with the kind of power that cut through silence. One was Amelie, Caspian's chief of staff, whose tone was always perfectly modulated, but now held a barely contained panic. The other was Caspian himself. His voice was a deep, resonant rumble, usually reserved for dictating terms to entire markets, but now it was strained, raw. Sera froze, a tray of untouched jasmine tea growing heavy in her hands. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The words that sliced through the gap in the door were not meant for anyone outside that room. The ledger must be sealed, Caspian. If the full extent of the Aether Project is revealed now, it will destroy everything. Your mother's legacy, your own foundation. Amelie's voice pleaded with a chilling, professional terror. Caspian's reply was slow, each syllable a hammer blow. It's not about the legacy, Amelie. It's about the collateral. If they find the real casualty count, the city will burn us down. Sera's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Aether Project. The name was a phantom echo from a dark corner of the city's history, a high-density redevelopment that had cleared out 3 entire blocks years ago, one of which had been her childhood neighborhood. She felt a sudden wave of dizziness, the tea tray rattling precariously. Confrontation in the gloom. The small sound was enough. The conversation stopped instantly. Sera knew, with a certainty that iced her blood, that the silence was worse than any noise. Before she could force her feet to move, the heavy oak door swung open. Caspian Thorne stood framed in the opening, a silhouette against the dim light of the study. He was taller than she remembered, impeccably dressed, but the careful composure he wore in public was completely stripped away. His eyes, usually a cool, calculating gray, were intense, fixed on her with the fierce, predatory focus of a man who realized his most protected secret had just walked into the light. "You heard," he stated, not as a question, but as an undeniable fact. Sera could only shake her head once, a tiny, desperate motion. The word "no" caught in her throat, a lie she couldn't push past the sudden terror. The ruthless decision. Caspian stepped out, closing the door behind him with a soft, ominous click that sealed the room and, she realized, her fate. He took the tray from her trembling hands and set it down with unnerving gentleness on a side table. "Don't insult my intelligence, Sera," he said, his voice dropping to a level that was more terrifying than a shout. It was the sound of complete, unchallenged authority. "What you heard cannot leave this floor. It cannot leave this building. It cannot leave you." Sera finally found her voice, a thin, reedy plea. "Please, don't do it. I didn't understand. I swear I won't speak." She didn't know what she was pleading against, firing, violence, something worse, but the terror was visceral. Caspian looked at her then, and for a fleeting, disorienting second, she saw a flicker of something that wasn't ruthlessness, a wrenching sort of exhaustion. But it vanished instantly, replaced by the glacial mask of the billionaire. He ignored her plea, his mind already calculating the only logical solution to a massive security risk. He signaled Amelie, who appeared instantly, her face pale but her demeanor composed. "Call Dr. Rourke. Arrange the isolation suite. Immediate, full-spectrum protective watch." Amelie nodded, already reaching for her secure line. Sera was left speechless, her breath trapped in her chest. She watched as Caspian gave the orders that would strip her of her freedom, all while maintaining the calm of a man reorganizing his office supplies. She was not a person to him, she was a variable, a risk factor that needed to be contained. As the silent, imposing security detail moved in, she backed away, her mind racing. It was then, as she glanced around the pristine, unforgiving opulence of the penthouse, that the pieces snapped together with a sickening clarity. Aether Project. Her father's life had been utterly dismantled by a foreclosure notice tied to a development signed by Thorne corporations. The loss of their home, the subsequent despair that had consumed her father, had started with a signature from a man she now worked for. She was trapped in the fortress of the very man who had shattered her family's world years ago, and he was now containing her to protect the larger, darker truth of that same empire. A history of harm. The security team led her quietly away, not with force, but with an inescapable finality. She didn't struggle, the shock too profound to allow for resistance. As she was escorted to a secluded wing of the penthouse, an elegant, secure suite designed for high-profile guests or, as she now understood, high-profile containment, she passed Caspian again. He stood by the window, looking out at the glittering, indifferent city he controlled. He didn't meet her eyes, but she felt his gaze, heavy and analytical, on her back. The maid was left speechless, not just by the billionaire's ruthless disregard for her desperate plea, but by the shattering realization of why she was being silenced. The man who had saved his family's future by signing away her own was now saving his present by locking her away. Gratitude for a life saved was utterly eclipsed by the ancient, burning wound of a life stolen. The silence that fell over her as the heavy, soundproof door of the isolation suite closed was a silence full of accusation, a debt of sorrow she had been unknowingly preparing to collect for years. The billionaire's burden. Caspian did not sleep that night. He stood on the terrace, the cold rain wetting his face, tasting like iron and regret. Amelie had managed the situation with clinical efficiency. The doctor was briefed, the suite secured, and the small network of staff was told Sera was on an urgent, prolonged leave for a sensitive family matter. Caspian knew the truth was much uglier. He had incarcerated an innocent woman because the alternative, the complete implosion of his family's corporate legacy and the potential for citywide chaos, was unthinkable. He was a man who dealt in equations, and the equation of her freedom versus his entire world was a cold, easy calculation. But as he watched the rain, he could not shake the image of her eyes, wide, not just with fear of him, but with a sorrow that looked ancient. He had signed papers years ago that dealt with numbers, not people. He had signed away blocks of property, not the heart of a young girl's home. The full weight of that long ago, careless stroke of a pen suddenly settled on him. He had sought control his whole life, but in locking Sera away, he had only confirmed his mother's insidious lesson, that control always comes at the expense of someone else's life. He knew he had to protect the secret, but the idea of holding her, a woman whose life he had inadvertently damaged once before, as collateral for his control was a poison that started to burn in his own chest. He looked at the city lights, and for the first time, the massive, glittering network seemed less like an empire and more like a cage, one he had just pulled a second, unwitting soul into. The isolation suite was designed for comfort, a silent contradiction to its purpose. Seraphina was surrounded by silk sheets, panoramic city views, and art that cost more than her family had earned in a lifetime. But it was still a cage, and the quiet was the loudest form of imprisonment. 2 days passed in this golden confinement. Dr. Alistair Rourke, a discreet and older physician whose loyalty was purely to Caspian's mother's estate, made brief, professional visits, monitoring her stress levels under the pretense of recovery. Sera answered in soft monosyllables, refusing to betray any fear, only allowing the quiet dignity of her grief to show. She performed small, habitual tasks, folding the crisp white blankets, arranging the books, as if adhering to a strict routine could somehow ward off the crushing reality of her situation. She avoided the windows, unable to face the indifferent, sprawling city that belonged to the man holding her captive. Caspian, despite his iron resolve, found himself consumed by an unsettling restlessness. He received constant, coded reports from Amelie regarding the asset's stability. He dismissed her attempts to rationalize his actions, knowing that no amount of corporate logic could justify the look in Sera's eyes. He saw her silence not as obedience, but as a judgment. She had not screamed, not fought, and that quiet acceptance was a heavier burden than any accusation. It signaled a profound, established sorrow, as if she had expected this kind of fate from the world, and specifically, from men like him. He began to test the boundary. He instructed the kitchen to send specific meals, things he remembered from an obscure, local eatery that had been famous in the neighborhood his corporation had flattened, simple, honest comfort food. He ordered a small selection of rare botanical books, knowing from her brief employment file that she had studied horticulture before having to drop out. These gestures were acts of a deeply guarded conscience, small acts of mercy that carried no power in them. The rejected kindness. Sera received the gifts with quiet confusion. The book sat unopened on the mahogany side table. The meals were eaten sparingly, yet always with perfect manners. When a rare, silk-lined coat was left folded on the chair, ostensibly for the evening chill, she wore it once during an outdoor, supervised hour, then folded it neatly and placed it back. She refused to acknowledge the gestures with gratitude, because gratitude would imply a debt, and she already knew the nature of the debt she was owed by the Thorne name. Acceptance would make her a kept thing, a silent recipient of his charity, erasing the truth of the harm he had caused. Her carefully maintained distance accused him more fiercely than any shouted condemnation could. One evening, Caspian found her seated by a small, enclosed fountain in the private garden attached to the suite. She wasn't looking at the water, her gaze was fixed on a single, hardy patch of clover struggling to survive between the paving stones. He approached her, his footsteps soundless on the smooth stone path. "The flowers are late this year," he said, using the same small, meaningless observation he might use with any subordinate. Sera started violently, her shoulders tightening. She didn't look up. "Yes, sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The soil is too rich, perhaps. It encourages leaf growth, not bloom." The metaphor was sudden, sharp, and entirely directed at him. She was saying his environment, his wealth, was stifling, not fertile. The confession of the ledger. Her immediate withdrawal after that small exchange tightened something painful behind his ribs. He dismissed her quietly, watching her retreat into the massive suite, a small, fragile shadow swallowed by the sheer scale of his wealth. The next morning, Caspian demanded the original project files on the Aether development, the old, physical paper files Amelie had been trying to hide. He locked himself in his study, pushing aside balance sheets and quarterly reports. He spent hours wading through the bureaucratic language, the careful corporate euphemisms, until he found it, the old foreclosure notice, tied to a small, two-story house on Juniper Street, Block 4. The realization hit him not as a surprise, but as a sickening confirmation. Sera's father. The file mentioned a disputed appraisal and a subsequent, rapid collapse of the family's assets. He remembered the project, a massive, aggressive land grab, finalized with his signature on hundreds of documents in a single, rushed afternoon when he was only 25, eager to prove his worth to his mother's board. He had treated the names as entries in a ledger. He could still remember the careless flick of his pen. An empire of guilt. Caspian looked out the window at the cityscape, at the cold, impressive architecture of his empire, and suddenly saw only the ghosts of what he had destroyed to build it. Every tower, every gleaming glass pane, was built on an invisible foundation of human loss. He could rescind the contract now, offer 100 times the value, but he knew time had already claimed the most important things, her father's peace, her childhood home, and the trust in the world that she now lacked. Ending next to the property information, the full, legal name of the primary occupant, Arthur Vane. That evening, he went to her door, a key card heavy in his hand. He didn't use it, instead knocking once, a hesitant, unnatural sound for him. Amelie tried to intervene, citing protocol, but he silenced her with a glare. Sera opened the door, dressed in her simple maid's uniform, her face a perfect mask of neutrality. He didn't enter. He simply stood there, in the doorway, blocking her escape, but not threatening her. The price of silence. "I know," he said, the words thick and difficult. "Juniper Street. Your father." Sera's composure finally fractured. Her breath caught, a tiny, ragged sound, and her eyes, which she had so carefully kept neutral, suddenly filled with an intense, raw grief. She didn't cry, but the pain was evident, a stark, unsheathed emotion that made his sophisticated world feel flimsy and insignificant. She didn't deny it. She didn't rail at him. She just nodded, once, the motion heartbreakingly small. "When you heard what you heard the other night," Caspian continued, his voice low, "about the collateral, about the casualties, did you think I was talking about the past? Or about you?" Sera finally lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes for the first time since her capture. Her voice was steady, utterly devoid of fear, filled only with the weary strength of a survivor. "I thought, sir, that you were talking about the cost of building anything with a signature." She was comparing her father's fate to the fate of the secret, both sacrifices to the Thorne machine. He realized the terrible, beautiful truth: she wasn't afraid he would kill her, she was afraid he would forget her, the way he had forgotten her father. She had been left speechless not by her fear, but by the weight of a history that now bound them irrevocably. He had sought to control her silence, but her silent suffering was controlling him. He stepped back, a single tear, a rare, hot betrayal of his emotional defense, sliding down his cheek. "I will send for the files," he promised, his voice choked. "I will make it right." He didn't say what he meant to make right: the money, the house, or the life he had inadvertently helped dismantle. Sera watched him, her expression a mixture of profound sorrow and a flicker of something he hadn't expected: pity. She simply closed the door quietly, leaving him alone in the sterile hallway, standing before the expensive, silent door of the gilded cage he had built for both of them. His mercy was proving to be a much heavier burden than his ruthlessness. He had to face the human cost, the consequence that no amount of wealth could erase. The confession in the doorway had shattered the pristine order of Caspian's life. He couldn't return to the cold, rational calculations that defined his business. He spent the next day poring over the old Aether Project files, the cold data now replaced by the sharp, immediate image of Sera's grieving eyes. He confirmed the scope of the potential scandal she had overheard. The project had indeed involved cutting corners on environmental safety years ago, resulting in a number of undisclosed illnesses among the original tenants near the site, a horrifying secret maintained by his estranged mother's legal team. The rising external threat. The external threat that Sera had inadvertently stumbled upon suddenly became critical. Amelie, ever vigilant, intercepted coded messages indicating a rival firm, led by a man named Silas Kent, was preparing to leak the Aether Project files, including the damning casualty count, to the press. Their goal wasn't justice, it was to dismantle Thorne corporations for a hostile takeover. Sera, confined in the penthouse, was both the key witness to the cover-up and the greatest symbol of Caspian's hidden guilt. Caspian realized his initial, ruthless decision to isolate her had been purely defensive, based on corporate control. But now, his motives had shifted. He wasn't protecting a secret, he was protecting her from the fallout, from being used as a pawn by Silas Kent. He saw his mother's cold hand in everything, including the decision to ruin Sera's family years ago to ensure quick, cheap land acquisition. The shared danger. Caspian entered the isolation suite without knocking this time, an act that felt less like invasion and more like desperate necessity. Sera was seated near the desk, reading one of the botanical texts. She looked up, her expression calm, yet expectant. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet vigilance. "Silas Kent is moving," Caspian stated, cutting straight to the point. "He knows the file exists. He doesn't know you heard the conversation, but he will target anyone close to the core issue. He walked to the window, the vast city spread out beneath them. I locked you in here to stop the leak. Now, I need to get you out to keep you safe from what's coming. Sera finally closed the book, setting it down with deliberate care. You cannot erase the past, Mr. Thorne, she said, her voice steady. But you can stop protecting the lie. She rose and approached him, something she had never done before. My father. She hesitated, and the pain flashed through her eyes. He didn't blame you for the signature. He blamed the system that let one man sign away hundreds of lives without looking them in the eye. I don't need your money or your pity for what happened. I need you to stop being the shield for what is wrong. The plea for truth. Her words, simple, honest, and utterly without malice, were the most profound challenge he had ever faced. She wasn't asking for personal revenge, she was asking for humanity. The confession of her father's history was not an accusation but a plea to him to choose a different path. Caspian's controlled facade finally cracked. He gripped the edge of the window frame, knuckles white. If I reveal the full truth about the Aether Project now, the casualty reports, my mother's involvement, I lose everything. The company, the fortune, the control. Kent will devour us. Control is what got us here, Sera whispered, taking a cautious step closer. You saved my life from the poison the other night, Mr. Thorne. Don't lose your soul protecting the people who sent it. A new foundation. In that moment, Caspian made a choice. He looked at Sera, seeing not a maid or a witness, but a woman whose quiet strength and unwavering moral clarity offered a new foundation, a painful but true path forward. He reached out and gently brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek, a gesture that was profoundly intimate and terrifyingly vulnerable. I would trade everything for one more hour of your peace, he said, mirroring the sentiment of his desperate promise from the night he saved her life, but this time, he meant the peace of her soul, not just her breath. If I go down on the truth. He turned to Amelie, who was waiting outside the suite, already prepared for disaster. Call a press conference. Immediate. Secure the main boardroom. I want every media outlet present. I'm opening the Aether ledger. The public reckoning. Caspian, with Sera silently standing beside him, not as a hostage, but as a silent, unwavering witness, stepped into the blinding lights of the press conference hours later. He didn't speak the calculated, corporate excuses he had used his whole life. He spoke with a raw, brutal honesty that shocked the room into silence. He confirmed the existence of the suppressed reports, acknowledged his mother's role, and accepted full responsibility for the catastrophic, careless decisions made years ago, including the initial foreclosures like the one that ruined the Vane family. He announced the complete dissolution of the Aether Project, the establishment of a massive humanitarian fund for all affected families, and his resignation from the CEO position, ensuring an independent board would take over to clean the ethical wreckage. The announcement was an act of complete corporate self-destruction, but it was also the most powerful, most human decision he had ever made. Speechless with love. The press erupted into chaos. Flashes exploded, and shouted questions filled the air. As the room devolved into a desperate scramble for scoops, Caspian looked down at Sera. He had chosen her silent truth over his loud, powerful empire. He had dismantled the gilded cage and walked into a storm of his own making, guided only by the quiet light she represented. Sera looked back at him. She saw the ruthless billionaire, the man who had ruined her father and then held her captive, transform into a man stripped bare, ready to face the consequences of his integrity. The grief was still there, the memory of her father was still a scar, but the hatred, the fear, and the accusation were gone, replaced by an overwhelming, stunned realization. He had kept his word, trading his empire for truth. The maid was left speechless, not by his former cruelty or his current downfall, but by the quiet, earth-shattering love she saw reflected in his eyes, a love that had cost him everything and given them both a new beginning. She simply reached out, placing her hand gently on his arm, a silent bond formed on the ruins of his empire. The storm raged outside the boardroom, but for the first time in years, the architecture of their lives was built on a true, strong foundation.